family history. So, last time we talked about this, we spoke about my dad's parents. And I told you what I know, what I remember, how I feel. Now I'm going to move on to my grandparents. I'm going to separate them and talk about my grandfather in this video. I'm going to show you a picture. This was my grandmother and my grandfather on their 50th wedding anniversary. My grandfather's name was Jesse. His name was actually Arnold. His middle name was Jesse. And he despised his name. Absolutely despised it. And so he went by his middle name most of his life. He was born in Oklahoma. And born, raised, met and married his wife there, had 3 children there. As a young man, actually as a child, he was put in an orphanage, he and his little brother. His little brother was still a baby and he was about 4 years old, and he was put in an orphanage. My great-grandmother didn't have the ability to take care of them at that point. But some people came along and decided they wanted to adopt the little brother, and the orphanage asked if they would like the, these 2 were siblings, would they like to take them? And they said no. They only wanted the baby because he wouldn't remember being adopted. It was very traumatic, as you can imagine, for my grandfather that his little brother, who he thought he was supposed to take care of, was suddenly taken away from him. About a year later, their mother came back for them, and the baby was gone, adopted. And so she took my grandfather back into her home to raise, and she continued to raise him for the rest of his life. In 1974, my grandfather actually found his little brother, who had only recently found out that he had even been adopted when both of his parents had passed away. And it was a huge shock to him. And they arranged a meeting where he brought his family to meet my grandfather and my grandmother. And it went well. It was actually shocking when I look at the pictures of the 2 of them together, how much they look alike. And I've thought a lot about that there's somebody else out there walking around that looks like you. And we have these relatives who, we share this DNA with, but they're not ours to claim. It was a tough relationship. It was not what my grandma or my grandfather had hoped for. There was some tension, just because my grandfather had some memories of how it had all happened, and it was not the way that his brother understood it to be. So it was difficult. They did stay in contact through letters and stuff, but it was never a close relationship, and that was always a real sadness and disappointment to my grandfather. Now, his last name, which I'm not going to share with you, but the last name that he went by was actually not his last name. That was my mother's maiden name. It was the siblings' name. It was the name they all knew, but it wasn't till years later that they had realized that my grandfather had actually been born with a different last name. But when my great-grandmother came back for them, she had remarried, and they all took on the name of the husband. My great-grandmother, at the time she had to give her children up, was supporting them however she could. And sometimes women have to do really sad and awful things to support their children, and that's what she had tried to do. Anything to put food in their stomachs. And she didn't give her children to an orphanage because she didn't love them. She did it because she wanted them to eat. So, you know, I've thought a lot about, would I ever have made a decision like that? And the fact is, I don't know. I've never been in those shoes. I've never had to worry about putting food on a table in front of my child or watching my child starve to death. And I have heard people say, well, I would never do this, or I would do anything but. Well, you don't know that. Do you think she didn't try? I think she probably tried everything. And at that time in our history, there weren't a lot of doors open to women. And she was a single mom. So she did what she had to do. And thankfully, she came back and was able to get my grandfather back. He worked as a young man in electronics. He did a lot of, TV was sort of a thing back in the day where, there were tubes in the back of the TV. A lot of you people that are my age will understand all that. Anybody younger is going, what the heck are you talking about? But my grandfather was in TV repair for a long time. He did a lot of electronic repair type stuff. And then he became a pastor. He was in the ministry for 42 years. He pastored in the town where I was born for 20 of those years. And that was in California. He married my grandmother, and they had 2 daughters and a son. And they were not able to raise the oldest daughter in their home. And I'll talk about more with that story when I talk about my grandmother. It'll make more sense there. During some pretty sketchy times and financially in our country, and he did what he needed to do for his family. But one day came and he decided, we're gonna move. Our daughter, my mother had moved with her husband to California, and they decided we're gonna move out there. So they loaded up their son, and across the country they went. That typical story of the Okies with the stuff on the top of their car. I'm sure that's pretty much the way they moved across the country. And they settled in California. He got a job with the church there that he was with for 20 years. And that's where so many of my memories come from, is watching him preach, watching him sing. This man could sing, oh my gosh, and play the guitar. He could play a guitar like nobody's business. He was just so talented. And I have a couple of recordings of him preaching and of him singing Ain't No Grave. Probably about 2 years ago, played one of those for the first time since he had passed away. And he's been gone now for 26 years. And so I just burst into tears because, it was like taking me right back to being a kid and watching him in his element. And I loved that. He loved my grandmother very much. He loved his congregation very much. He did anything for those people. He did probably too much in some instances. He definitely loved his children and his grandchildren. And he was a very in charge kind of person, very concerned about the way he presented himself. So he always dressed beautifully, had a beautiful watch on, always had fantastic shoes. He was one of those people that could, barter with somebody and work out some kind of a deal and always come out on the good end. And then they moved to Northern California and they bought a home there. In 1993, he ended up in the hospital. Now, for several years, he had Parkinson's. He never admitted to that. He had been diagnosed, but he would not believe the diagnosis. He thought it was something he was going to cure. It was going to go away. He would not admit that he had that. But he did shake, and it affected his heart, and he ended up in the hospital. And this was at the time when our third child was just about ready to be born. And so she was born, and they were getting ready to do open heart surgery. And actually the doctors let my husband and I bring the kids in to see him, because they had told us they really didn't believe that he would make it through the surgery. That's how weak his heart was. But he did survive that surgery. And it was rough. It was a rough time. And for about 3.5 months, 4 months, he was in the hospital. He had gone to kind of a care center where, you know, you're supposed to go there for rehabilitation, but he was not there for rehabilitation. He was there because he couldn't go home. My grandmother could not have taken care of him. And so my mother had actually been taking care of my grandmother while my grandfather was in the hospital this whole time. And my mother needed a break, and so she had come over to spend the weekend at my house. And the phone rang that morning, and I handed her the phone, and I knew right away. And she turned around and just had a tear running down her face and said, "I need to go." And my grandfather had passed away, and so she needed to go be with my grandmother. At that time, we lived about an hour away from where my grandfather was. And it changed a lot when he passed away. We didn't even realize what a rock he had been for the family. We didn't realize how much we all relied on him, just his presence. We didn't rely on him so much to do things. I mean, you know, my husband is a jack of all trades. He can do anything. And so he did a lot of stuff for family members. But just my grandfather's presence was so important. And suddenly that was gone. And it really kind of threw things into a tailspin for a while. Especially for my grandmother, definitely for my mother. And yeah, I really miss him. I miss his wisdom. We never seem to know how wise somebody is until they're gone. And then suddenly you miss their advice so much. And I definitely miss his advice, and I miss just his calming presence. He had a very calming spirit. Next time, we'll talk about Grandma. I don't think calming spirit would be the way I would describe